Okay, this is an afternoon Journeys and Podcast session, and we're going to be talking to Benjamin Kohlmann, who we'll call Ben, who has worn many hats. I'm going to let him introduce himself in just a second, but we're going to be talking today about innovation within what are normally rigid hierarchical systems. And then in the chat here, I'll just let everyone introduce themselves real fast. Joe, can you jump in there?
Yeah, hi, I'm Joe Cost. I'm teacher of social studies and theory of knowledge at the Uruguayan American School, and then I also do some stuff with maker spaces and design and technology.
The thing I just said because my mic was muted, so I'm going to go ahead and repeat it. I'm assuming everyone can hear me, so I'm going to go ahead and say it again. I'm Chris. I'm in Bogota, and I have worked with Natalia Leon, who's also on. She worked at the same school with us, Colegio Nueva Granada, and she's an Apple Distinguished Educator who works in many multimedia projects and contributes in many forms to this project as she jumps in now here and there. We're going to be talking to Benjamin Kohlmann, who has been in the Navy and is now at Stanford Business School, and he's going to help walk us through innovation within rigid hierarchical systems. So, hi Ben, how you doing?
Hey Chris, thanks for having me. I appreciate the invite.
So, can you give us kind of a background on like the hats you wore within the Navy, just so we get kind of a picture of um, the different ways that you worked with the CRIC or the CRIC, which is the quick innovation groups. What other hats did you wear in the Navy?
Yeah, so I started off as a naval aviator, spent 8 years flying F-18s, both as a combat pilot and then an instructor pilot in San Diego. And following that stint in San Diego, I created an organization called Disruptive Thinkers, which attempted to link up innovative military officers with entrepreneurial civilians in an exchange of ideas to try to get best practices. And from that, as we grew and got more attention, it got the eye of an admiral who was putting together a group called the Chief of Naval Operations Rapid Innovation Cell, or colloquially known as the CRIC. And the purpose of that organization was to bring together 10 to 15 junior officers and enlisted folks who had ideas that were a little bit countercultural, but give them the chance to build out their projects with money, funding, and advocacy in ways that the Navy had never seen before. And so I was recruited to come on board with that. And from there, did that for about 2 years right before I got out. And simultaneously, I was also asked to be the speechwriter and aide-de-camp to the commander of U.S. Fleet Forces in Norfolk, Virginia. So I was running the CRIC while doing this staff job for a high-level commander.
We came to know you through a Harvard Business Review article, and one of the things that it talks about is how you formed these groups. And when they talk about it, you said that you had to find a balance between troublemakers, rabble-rousers, disruptors, heretics, and radicals. When you look for an innovative group, do you only look for these radical high-risk takers, or what do you look for as far as creating a well-balanced, innovative group?
I think the key are people who think differently about the world. And I'm a rule follower. Like I grew up, cleaning my room and high discipline, and joining the military. I was the guy who always showed up with the uniform the uniform ironed and the boots polished, and thought that I had to follow every single order to the letter, and if I wasn't meeting my rules. But I also had a deep intellectual curiosity about the world. And so I think you want those folks who have really disruptive ideas, the ones who question the status quo, but also can take that questioning and take action on it. Find the advocates, find the resources in places that most normal people wouldn't think to look or wouldn't want to make the effort to look. And finally, you just want to have passionate people, those who believe so deeply in an idea that they're willing to stake their personal and professional reputation on an idea they believe in so heavily. And if you can tap into those passions in people and can give them resources to actually realize their goals and realize what's really important to them, and let them free, you can get some pretty exponential results. So yeah, I mean, those are the key elements that we found. You know, the comment about rabble rousers, and I think there's some stories in that article about individuals being fired from certain, you know, high-profile positions aboard ships. You know, not all rabble rousers or, for lack of a better term, non-disciplinarians are going to be effective innovators, because, you know, there are folks who just complain and they don't want to do anything about it. But if you find the folks who complain with a purpose and actually have solutions and are willing to take their own time to do it, then you've found a winning combination. But it's about building that team and finding those right individuals.
You know, you talked about blogging and disruptive thinkers, and you know, as I've been reading around you, I'm finding all of these pockets of podcasts and YouTube videos and Twitter feeds, and I'm kind of amazed that there's so much peripheral chatter going on yet within the Navy system. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that as far as keeping ideas going, of getting people together? I mean, I know you've talked about the importance of face-to-face time, but
Yeah.
what about the social technologies, the social, you know, all of the blogging and things that go on? How does that help?
Yeah, I think that is probably the most critical element to maintaining a culture of creativity and innovation, are those informal networks that develop among people who are organically drawn towards each other. So in the military, we have a very significant bias towards hardware and technology. You know, whether it be a brand new aircraft system or a ship or a missile system or some sensor that we have that's going to change the landscape of the battlefield, we think those will solve our problems. And while those are important, what really matters the most is engaging with the human element. And humans thrive in social relational environments. And the biggest thing we saw come out of these networks that we created, whether it's Disruptive Thinkers or the CRIC or the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, were people who wouldn't otherwise have met becoming friends and engaging on projects that we never could have predicted. Putting people in the same room to have informal conversations where they discover a common interest that they want to go off and build a side project on their own, and really, you know, go out to the bar for beers afterwards and like talk about life and figure out where the common points of reference are, and do so across boundaries that typically aren't bridged. So in the military, we're incredibly parochial. You know, the Navy rarely talks to the Air Force, rarely talks to the Marine Corps, except in D.C. But outside of that, you know, we have very specific bases, we have specific missions and purposes. And what the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, which was an informal organization I helped create, did was it brought young individuals from across the services together in one place without the yoke of having a service-specific purpose, and allowed them to have unconstrained free play amongst each other. And we learned from guys who spent, you know, 10 years on the ground, combined with folks who'd been on ships for 6 years, combined with special forces operators who had seen something different than infantry operators, who had seen something different than the undersea operators. And getting all those perspectives together in one room allowed us to think about the world differently. And one example I like to use is, you know, I mentioned my background as an F-18 pilot. We're very biased towards wanting to put resources towards the aviation arm. And yet, in my interaction with my peers, I came to realize that the submarine community had far more bang for the buck, if you will, in terms of unproclaimed successes. And so I became a big advocate of pushing more money towards the submarine force as opposed to naval aviation. And while I didn't have really any influence in making those budgets, just exposing yourselves to other ideas and people who have different experiences with you, and if you have an open mind, you're actually going to probably change your position on things because you've finally realized what the realm of the possible is. And that's critical. And that requires a mindset that's open to new ideas, that can challenge the way the status quo is going. And it's also a mind that's willing to change. You know, there are many things in my life that I've reversed position on because new evidence and new people I've met have helped me understand the world in a way I hadn't considered before, and it made sense to me. So the only thing I could do was to change my opinion and start advocating for that new position.
And I wanted to jump in for a second. Ben, that kind of description reminded me a little bit. It's not about some of the ideas behind what started with 3M and Google adopted it, kind of this idea of 20% time and this idea of chance encounters and creative collisions really start producing results that are unexpected when you give the people the time and the resources to kind of pursue them.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. You know, a couple of the things that we saw were very effective was traveling together. You know, for the Senior Rapid Innovation Cell, we would go on field trips of 2 or 3 days to visit, you know, regions of the country that the military normally wouldn't touch. So Silicon Valley, Austin, Texas, Boston, Massachusetts, and let us engage with, you know, official organizations, understand their processes. But the places that we grew the most and where the best ideas came were the unstructured environments, you know, over dinner or over drinks afterwards or over the lunches where there was no agenda and our creativity was allowed to flow freely. And some of our most interesting and long-lasting projects actually emerged from those conversations. And the same thing happened at our, you know, 3-day Defense Entrepreneurs Forum. We had very compelling, very energetic, and intelligent speakers give us great insights. And yet it was almost impossible to call people back to order because they were so engrossed in the informal conversations that they were having. And to me, you know, I'm a very schedule-oriented guy, but I loved seeing that because it meant that we were having an impact. It wasn't just folks showing up to put a check in the block. They were there because like they were deeply engaged and immersed in the process. And that's what creates one, loyalty, but also an engaged organization that's willing to do things and find advocates to make change happen.
Just think about how opposite most of our school structures are to that environment.
Yeah. Well, and you know, to the education and school standpoint, one of the things that inspired me to create Disruptive Thinkers was the realization that there is so much else happening in the world that I did not know about. I needed to educate myself on things like biomimicry and how nature is informing technology development, or how architects view the world and their concept of beauty and building up structures in such a way that provide both simple, you know, Maslowian needs of a place to live, but also higher level, you know, purpose and like feeling comfortable in your environment, combined with folks in financial services or even like new educational models that help transition kind of a 20th century agricultural mindset to the nine-month school year to more of an immersive learning experience that transcends specific subject matter, but helps us understand the global economy and the global implications of technology in a broader way. And you know, I'm a dedicated lifelong learner, and by that I mean even though I'm formally in school, this summer I created a curriculum for myself to learn about money. This is going to sound ridiculous, but because we use it every day, but understanding the origins of where money comes from. What is the psychology behind this social technology? Is it actually like a gold bar, or is it something deeper that's actually more mutable? And understanding how finance plays a role in our world and how it affects everything from education to the military to politics. And so taking small mini modules on things that are interesting helps me understand reality better and gets me to a place where I can then apply those lessons in a wide variety of areas. And if you stop learning, like, you're going to stop growing, and that growth really allows for innovation.
What about within organizations? There's always going to be B players and A players.
Yeah.
And you're always going to need people that are kind of just like work the normal routines. But when you create something like CRIC, that's a different kind of space. So how do you be an A player and then have to go back to the world of the B players, or how does that function within the Navy?
That's a great question and something that our organization is still struggling with. And the biggest manifestation of that is most members who were asked to join the Senior Rapid Innovation Cell, or the CRIC, chose to leave the Navy afterwards. Because after being given an incredible opportunity to run multi-million-dollar projects and integrate technology that are now being used throughout the fleet, their next duty station was back into the traditional career progression model. And for a lot of these entrepreneurial innovative types, that just wasn't a quick enough opportunity for them to realize their full potential. And so we've seen a significant flight of the most, what I would contend, most innovative folks that I saw out into the private sector. It's not to say that there aren't good people who remain, because there certainly are, and there are creative thinkers. But it's just to say that those who are more entrepreneur-minded will likely not stick around in hierarchies unless there's incentive for them to do so. And those young folks who have done so within government are typically the ones in civilian roles, so politically appointed positions where they aren't subject to civil service rules, they aren't subject to the traditional promotion mindsets, where there's not limits to what they can make salary-wise or contribution-wise. But within the Navy itself, it's very difficult for a true superstar to have the type of influence as, say, a Tom Brady. He was 25 years old and he won a Super Bowl MVP. You have Barack Obama, who was elected president in his mid-40s. You have Mark Zuckerberg and other entrepreneurs who in their late 20s created multi-billion-dollar companies. If there's not even the potential for that upside within many large organizations, and I think that pushes out the most innovative and entrepreneurial types from those organizations. Now, societally, they're going to go off and do great things elsewhere. But if organizations want to keep those truly revolutionary and exponential players, they have to find ways to capture the imagination of those individuals and give them the purpose that allows them to be so effective. One of the things that we saw with the CRIC was, finding those individuals who had felt repressed for 5 or 10 years, and they were only there because they had an obligation to fulfill, and they'd basically given up. They just kind of bided their time. But what the CRIC allowed them was an opportunity to unleash their full talents. And when those talents were realized, it was amazing to see the psychological change in their demeanor and their work ethic towards going from 40 hours of minimal work to 100 hours plus of high octane, let's get this stuff done mindset, because we were engaging with their passions and giving them the runway to do what they knew how to do. And so you really have to understand who the A and B players are, and B players are critical, but every person's going to need a different type of motivation, and a true leadership kind of recognizes that motivation and inspires different people with different incentives.
Talia has a question about going back to this idea of the unstructured opportunities for adults to exchange ideas, and then trickling that down into student life, where students also have the creative time, but then they also have the productive time as well. Could you walk us through any clues on how the process of a project looks like, going from we work with design thinking, so we look at kind of immersion and empathy building, and then defining a problem, and then spend a lot of time just on that fluctuation between the divergent thinking and convergent thinking. What did it look like for you?
Yeah, I think, at a high level, the most important element of all that is execution and opportunity to directly apply what you've learned in the creative space. So, I'm a fan of design thinking. I think that, however, it is one tool to use amidst many. One of my frustrations with that methodology is it doesn't always lead to tangible results that someone can look to and say, I spent a week brainstorming and now I can actually move forward with the project. Certainly opens up your eyes, especially in the empathy portion, to what the true problem is. But I think finding a way to take those ideas and actually implement them is the best way to both do learning and also to operationalize creativity. We visited a university up in Boston called Olin College. You all may be familiar with it, but they were formed about 10 years ago, and they take in run-of-the-mill 18-year-old folks to be freshmen. It's an engineering program, but they do no classroom work their first year. All of their education is project-based, and so they give them a project to solve, and anytime they run into a problem where they have to actually understand the fundamentals of physics or chemistry or math, that's when the teacher introduces the specific concepts. So instead of just going through a calculus book from point A to all the way to the end where you finally do derivatives and integrals, like they will actually apply that directly to the work these students are doing. And by the end of their third or fourth year, their capstone project is they're actually given $70,000 in budget to solve a problem presented by a company. And what we saw from these students was poise, confidence, a deep understanding of the subject matter, because they hadn't just learned it by rote memorization or exercises, they had learned it by living it. And they could actually see the direct applicability of what they were learning to the outside world. And these were not different concepts or even less concepts than what I was taught in college, but they were just taught in a way that actually integrated with what the students were seeing in real life. And I think that's critical when it comes to teaching, is, a lot of students, they look at history, they look at, English, they look at all these things from a process standpoint are incredibly dry and boring. But if you can talk about like what's going on in the presidential election right now with past historical examples of like the election of 1800, where you had a vicious campaign between two candidates, or the slavery debates, or things like that, and actually directly apply those lessons learned, then I would contend that those will stick far more deeply in the student's mind and also engage them in a way that isn't traditionally thought of. So I think finding practical ways to apply and execute on the ideas is critical to ensuring the retention of that knowledge.
I know you had an article in Disruptive Thinkers about the future. Maybe it wasn't from you, but there was an article about the future sailor, like what the 21st century sailor would look like.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of want to talk about what you wrote in where the military needs more disruptive thinkers, and where you quote from Joshua Cooper Ramo, where he says, "We've left our future largely in the hands of people whose single greatest characteristic is they are bewildered by the present."
Yeah.
In education, well, if you want to just comment on that, I have kind of a series of questions from that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start. So it's interesting because the man who I took that from, I think he's a pretty controversial guy, but the problem with that quote got me in a lot of hot water with a lot of people after they read that, because it was an implication of senior leaders, and yet it resonated because the reason I wrote that was the way the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were proceeding at that point is we were fighting a foe that we thought looked like the Soviet military, and were applying principles and strategies that had worked in the first Gulf War, when an insurgency is fundamentally different. They were far outpacing us. They were using social media, as you see ISIS doing, to outpace our ability to engage. There's a quote that comes from the Vietnam War, where an old American general met up with an old Vietnamese general, and the American general said to the Vietnamese guy, "We won every single battle. How did we lose the war?" And the Vietnamese general basically replied, "It doesn't matter that you won the battles. Like, the war wasn't being fought on the battlefield; it was being fought elsewhere." And if you don't recognize what the actual center of gravity is, not just in terms of combat, but in terms of the human psychology and what the true thing at stake is, you will always apply the wrong tools. Another example is, we spent over $2 billion to try to defeat improvised explosive devices which were killing our members on the battlefield, and it took 5 or 10 years to do so. And we had this great device that we rolled out, and for about a week it defeated the insurgents' ability to do that. But they just adapted immediately with a $30,000 off-the-shelf tool that defeated this multi-billion-dollar system. And that's because they were able to operate so much quicker than us and understood the battlefield and the environment in a way that we couldn't, being removed and kind of biased toward their technology solutions. So, in the 21st century, I contend that those people who will be the most effective leaders are the ones that can integrate from the widest variety of practical professions as possible. And so understanding a wide view of the world and what's truly shaping these things will help those people be more successful than others who are wedded to a specific specialization where once it gets disrupted, they have nowhere to go and they can't adapt to it.
Often in teaching, especially at our larger institutions, there's this idea of just like interchangeable piece where you're just a widget that can be replaced in the next school and they can bring someone else in to fill your position, which I think relates to kind of what you're talking about.
Oh, yeah.
And yet over the years, what I see are the richness of experiences that people come into education late, the ones who have worked other jobs, who are just really interested in becoming a teacher or career changing or whatever else, often have some incredible input to offer. But often within education culture, it's not exactly appreciated or appropriated and not really used. You had an article where you talk about how the iPad changed the way the war was navigated from the air. That before, there was paper maps in the planes, and then you talk about how simple use of an iPad could make that a lot easier. But you discussed the process of getting that iPad into the plane and any the resistance within the bureaucracy to get that done. Could you comment on that process?
Yeah. So as a combat aviator, we would typically go into the cockpit with 20 or 30 pounds of maps, and each, because you never knew where you're going to be called in all of Afghanistan. You could have a specific briefing point over a 20 square mile area, and then when you get up there, you realize down in Kandahar, you get a call that there's troops in contact up in Kabul, which is a 200 or 300-mile trek. You'd have to pull out these new maps and find them. And this was right around the time the iPad was coming out, and Google Maps was making a big splash. And so some enterprising junior officer said, well, why don't we just download all this to an iPad, and there you can have all your maps right at the fingertip. And one of the challenges in the government military procurement process is everything, and I truly believe this, every regulation we have is there for a reason. Like, there's a reason why you can't have sole source contracts where you have to compete it out, because somewhere in the past some congressperson or military guy gave the $5 million contract to his brother, and there's nepotism and all this, and so we're mitigating against the downside. But what happens is you also mitigate against the upside, and I contend that the upside is where the true exponential gains come. So another example of that is with the 3D printing project I did. We wanted to put a $20,000 printer on a U.S. warship for the first time. And we were told by the acquisition folks that we had to go through a $500,000 to 12-month process to certify that the plug that went into the ship would actually not short out the entire ship. And this was absurd, because this was the same electrical voltage that pretty much every other device was using on the ship, and furthermore, it wasn't connected to any computer systems. So we got creative and found a contract vehicle that enabled us to go ahead and do it anyway. And to be honest, we may have bent the rules a little bit to put it on there. But a year later, after it had been a wild success, the Navy had adopted it, kind of fleet-wide, we got an email from this low-level bureaucrat from Hawaii that said, you need to cease and desist with this 3D printing project because you haven't gotten the appropriate paperwork signed up to have this on the ship. And to me, that just highlighted the pace of change and how rapidly true innovators are able to move compared to sclerotic bureaucracies. Again, there's regulations in place for a reason, but I think you always have to evaluate, are these regulations still relevant in the environment we have today? So a lot of nepotism is going to be mitigated by the fact that social media is going to eliminate these sweetheart contracts. A congressperson is not going to give their buddy a deal when tweets are going to be able to come out and basically kill that guy's reputation. So unfortunately, regulations are not as adaptive to the technology advances that we have. This is something we need to think about in terms of integrating new ideas. And really, the fundamental issue with the iPad was junior officer had a great idea. He just went ahead and did it and had incredible combat effectiveness. The fact there were actually senior leaders who let him do that. That was critical. People who understood the importance of the situation and let him realize his potential and save a lot of lives in the process. So.
Yeah, I'm trying to draw the education parallels, and while we do have minds at stake, we're not talking about like the loss of life or anything like that. So it's a pretty powerful metaphor that you're talking there. In education, we have standards, and there's a lot of pressure to standardize. And there's standardized testing, but there's also this always having to be accountable to standards. And when we incorporate technology, it's usually predominantly for accountability and efficiency, which these aren't bad things, but I feel like they're missing the exploring new forms of collaboration or deeper forms of metacognition, or broadening the access to a cognitive architecture through giving kids kind of multimodality of both production and input as well. And yet, criteria for teaching has very little to do with understanding how these technologies work, how they deepen our pedagogies, how they create new types of networks that you're talking about with disruptive thinkers and tweets and things like that. What does the new leader look like to you that would understand the need to kind of change this paradigm? What do you think they would have to take into account within a hierarchical structure that would allow teachers to kind of explore these new areas?
I think there needs to be a recognition that the world is changing, and a willingness to adapt new techniques to different situations. So I think one of the things that will start to revolutionize education is this idea of personalized learning. I think for a lot of, pretty much every generation for the past 100, 200 years, when you're 5 years old, you go to kindergarten, maybe plus or minus 1 or 2 years. And when you're 6 years old, you go to first grade, plus or minus 1 or 2 years. But people develop at different rates. Like, I'm even seeing this with my 19-month-old son. Like, he was a late walker. And so the doctor was freaking out about this. because he wasn't within the norms of certain areas. Yet in other areas, he was like really a lot quicker than other people in terms of his cognitive ability and ability to talk. And so finding ways to understand the specific needs of specific students, I think, is critical. And this is very difficult to do in a classroom of 30 or 40 folks. But with better analytical tools, you can start to understand and see trends in an intuitive way that will the teachers will be able to direct specific lesson plans for specific students. You're kind of seeing this as well in terms of personalized medicine, where it used to be in the past that a doctor would prescribe the same thing to every single person who had the same disease and have wildly different results because, yeah, statistically 60% of the folks respond in X way, but again, 40% of the people are being left out. And so the treatment prescribed is not working well. But if you understand their DNA, if you understand their ethnic background, if you understand the environment they're in, you can prescribe very different remedies that will actually create better outcomes for far more people. And so similarly in education, I think it's incumbent upon the establishment to figure out a way to do more personalized education. Still get the basics down, but deliver it in a way that is relevant to the specific environment. And I don't want to get too political here, but one of the challenges I think with something like Common Core is, I think it's great in concept, but application in theory is incredibly challenging, simply because people are in such different places in their lives, and what we need to teach for in different parts of the country are different. Like the student going to school in Silicon Valley likely needs to know something different than the person who's going to be living in the Midwest for the rest of their lives. Like, and it's not to typecast people too early, and people should have the opportunity to explore whatever they want. But like the different things they experience will be relevant for different people. So having locally adaptive educational means while globally available opportunity, I think, is a really interesting thing to explore and find out how to integrate.
Echoing some thoughts of an educator I follow, Young Zhao, who's at Oregon State University, who talks about the same thing about we don't need more standardization, we need less. We need schools, I guess, much like they were around the turn of the 1900, where you had German schools, Italian schools, you had bilingual education all over the place, just naturally developing.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your future company. Or that I didn't know you had a startup thin air, but when I wrote this question, I was thinking that you would get out of Stanford and start a company. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the economist Nassim Taleb, who talks about
absolutely.
Anti-fragile systems, where a certain level of experimental chaos is healthy and it leads to longevity and more stable environments. And then Adam Grant, who interviewed you for the article in the Harvard Business Review, he studied startups that go public and those that hired with cultural cohesion hiring strategies over radical collaboration strategies, where you have like a diverse set of heads around the table. Well, they were successful the first year, but then they became less innovative after that first year. When you start your first company, who will you hire, and more importantly, where do I send my resume now?
That's a great question. I'm working for a company now that's about 30 folks. They've been around for 2 or 3 years, just came out of stealth mode. I'm just kind of an intern fly on the wall observing what's happening. But one of the most striking and interesting things I've noticed from the employees that are here is the CEO has been very deliberate in who he hires. And while there are certain hires that have to be made based on how rapidly the product is evolving, he will not hire someone unless they fit in with the culture of the company. And while the short term it leads to some challenges and additional work for the individuals in the firm, in the long run, it creates this really interesting cohesion that allows success to occur, because you're only getting the right type of people for the role, and you're sacrificing short-term success for long-term longevity. And like that, to me, really speaks volumes to how I want to hire. I also think it's critical that you let people do what they're good at. Micromanagement is something that I really bristle under, and I think a lot of folks do as well. A true leader is someone who can set a vision and then find the people who execute on that vision within their areas of expertise. So I'll reference the CEO I'm working for again. He's a coder by trade, and he built some phenomenal technology in the past and he was the guy who came up with this technology that I think is going to revolutionize data security. But about 6 months ago, the coders he hired basically banned him from using GitHub, which is the code collection, because he just wasn't up to their standards in terms of the mistakes he was making and the level of competence. And to his credit, he said, you know what, guys, you're absolutely right. Like, I hired you guys because you're the experts. You are surpassing what my capabilities are. I need to focus on strategy and growing the business. And like, to me, a leader who has the humility to understand where his limitations are, but also where he can bring the most value, is really critical. And that also empowers the subordinates to then realize that they are critical elements of this organization. They're more motivated to put forth their best effort and actually have true ownership in the company. So it goes from being a one-person show to a guy who's the visionary and highly respected, but it's collaborative in the sense of this is a full team effort, and we're truly leveraging, regardless of age or experience, the talents that the individuals here have to offer.
Not within the Navy. I mean, in education, there's always the I forget who wrote the article, but there was a great article about just everyone's second job of hiding what you don't know, and everyone pretending that they know how to do things they don't know how to do. How did you find that within the Navy? Like, I guess my impression from the outside is that it would be even more strict than education, and my experience in education is that there's always people are working harder at that second job than they are at their first, of hiding what they don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on what culture you find yourself in. I think I was fortunate in the naval aviation community because we have very rigid and strict debrief policies. You know, we have this concept of no rank in the cockpit, where any junior person who's flying with a senior person has the right and expectation that if they see something wrong, they talk about it. And you know, that translated to the debrief itself. You know, we would nitpick every single thing we did. And one of the most effective techniques that I used for students that I was teaching was, as soon as we get in the room for the debrief, I would just very briefly outline the things that I did wrong. And that signaled to the student that it's okay to talk about your failures. We're here to learn. I'm not perfect either. You know, even though I have far more experience than you, I'm still trying to work to be the best that I can. And that culture of feedback and growth is critical. Now, to some point, it becomes institutionalized so much that it becomes kind of just like a pro forma activity. You lose some of the true authenticity, but instilling that feedback-rich culture, you know, especially in an environment where people's lives are at risk, like, there is an incentive to actually improve. Look at SpaceX as well. You know, one of the things I admire most about that company is they broadcast live every single one of their launches, and that's gutsy because they're pushing technology to the limit. And as you've seen on social media, they've broadcast many crashes that they've had, like rockets blowing up on the pad, rockets blowing up as it lands. And yet that openness and authenticity actually endears them to the public at large, such that when they do have a success, people are rallying around them. And I think it's very difficult in most organizations to have that culture of, we're going to showcase our failures, because in the past people have been punished for it. So I think you got to find ways to actually reward that type of honesty and true feedback, and that starts at the top. You know, a CEO or a principal or someone who is willing to acknowledge their mistakes and showcase where they went wrong in a public way will actually gain incredible loyalty, and whatever face they think they might lose by being transparent, they'll more than gain in the trust that they have from their subordinates, and that the subordinates will know that they have their best interests in mind, and they too are under the same set of rules and are willing to grow and improve from that. So I think you got to lead by example and be willing to showcase your own warts, but show how you're improving it, and also just encourage others to work towards self-improvement.
I have a couple more questions, but I want to check in with you on time, because normally we just say like 30 minutes. We're definitely willing to go longer. What does your time frame look like for us?
I can answer a couple more than enough.
Okay. Yeah, but please cut us off whenever, because otherwise
Sure.
we'll take your entire afternoon. You recommended in the Harvard Business Review, you gave some great readings and links, and one was to looking at methods of a composer, orchestrating through very little movement, and forcing the musicians to actually look at each other and try to figure out what's called for in the next movement. This is an incredible metaphor for leadership. How do you interpret that?
Yeah, I think the thing that resonated for me in that particular instance is what the what I understand the composer wanting to do was to not just be the central node for attention and direction. Obviously, it's critical to have someone on the front of the stage kind of directing the traffic of a symphony, but if you can instill a deep understanding of what other elements within the organization are doing, you, in a moment of crisis, can react in a way that is in the best interest of the organization. So if for some reason the composer did something completely wacky, or something happened to him, the show could continue because you're attuned to what else is happening. And you build this deep trust amongst other members of the organization such that you realize what part you play in the whole, as opposed to just being a direct report to this one centralized node. It creates more of a spider web network as opposed to like your traditional hierarchical top-down model. And I think because you're attuned to what's happening in other parts of the organization, in this case the symphony, you're better able to collaborate with them on side projects and engage with them because you intuitively know what drives them and what's making their part, how their contribution is of value to the organization.
Educator's lens, I just see this, both top down and within the classroom. There's a lot of talk about, not showing kids exactly how to do things, but kind of giving them the what, driving questions, and having them struggle to try to figure that out. So it's an incredible metaphor for us to think about, both within our leadership hierarchy, but also, within the classroom. I had to watch it a couple of times and just busted out laughing when he's orchestrating with mere facial gestures. His body's completely still, and he's just giving them like lip movements and things.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of applicability there.
Another couple of things you referenced were, one was Sherlock Holmes, the BBC version, and the other was Ender's Game. And in Ender's Game, I'm not sure if I'm getting at what I think you were trying to reference there, but he becomes a leader who has to rely on all of the abilities of the people that are working around him, and he doesn't always know exactly how they're going to complete their objective, but he puts people in positions where they have to kind of figure out themselves. Is that where you were going with that, or is there something else?
Yeah, I mean there are so many lessons in that particular book. I think the one you identified is important. I think it also speaks to. I was always enamored of the battle room scenes and the challenges that were thrown at Ender and his creative ways of dealing with those situations. And obviously it's fiction, so the author can do whatever he wants. But even the political lessons that he has for group dynamics. And the tune that he creates from kind of his outcasts in his platoon that are like special projects / special forces folks. And this resonated for me in the standpoint of the Senior Rapid Innovation Cell, is you find the guys who can go out and do crazy stuff. They're not going to be the majority of your folks, but you really put them to tasks that require deep creativity and let them run wild. That resonated with me. Just the standpoint of focusing on people with talent as opposed to age and rank and hierarchy. Like, find those individuals that are just so good at what they do, focus on their ideas rather than kind of their past accomplishments. Like, all of these things tied together in a remarkable narrative just make it a phenomenal book in many ways, but, inspiring. And even the ambiguity, I think one of the things that's stayed with me is, Ender is this character who is basically pushed by the government to do something that he doesn't know what he's doing. And while all of the world is counting on him to save their environment, at the end of the book, when he finally succeeds, there's deep ambiguity in his own heart about what actually occurred and what the perception is publicly and what the reality is in terms of what was actually just perpetrated. And I think that tension, especially coming back out of war, when I read it again, I realized that the public view of how things are and how politicians manipulate and shape arguments and observations really is different than reality in a lot of ways. And you as an individual have to be very discerning in understanding what's truly happening behind the scenes. Otherwise, our own personal biases and heuristics that we use to help short-circuit the world may lead us astray into what reality actually shows. So I think there's an immense number of deep lessons from a very good but simple children's book.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. One of my big takeaways from Ender's Game, I've read it a couple times. I actually use it in my theory of knowledge class as well, is the reorientation that Ender does once he enters the battlefield, where the new environment has no up or down, right? The zero gravity makes those references in the gravity world meaningless. And his turn of phrase is, down is the enemy gate. Down isn't, your feet, isn't below you, it's where you want to go.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And having that leadership ability to reorient the perspective of your subordinates in a way that's relevant in an ambiguous and confusing environment gives them an anchor with which to iterate from that's critical to their own self-actualization.
So, what about Sherlock? I'm not sure. I mean, I watched the episodes and I was kind of enamored by this idea that it's almost like the references to fractal theory that you had as well, to Benoit Mandelbrot, who came up with fractal theory very slowly just by making a lot of observations about the world, things that a kindergartner could observe, and yet he comes up with this system that can be then applied in a multitude of different settings and disciplines. And it takes people decades to prove the things that he discovered. What was your attraction to Sherlock, and maybe you could shed light on the attraction to fractal theory as well?
Yeah, I think Sherlock was just a phenomenally well done TV show. It had very compelling villain. It had folks who were wrestling with deep challenges. I just love the attention to detail and like the way, and this goes for the books as well, but just the way that Sherlock Holmes is able to take small things about the world that people perceive in different ways, but his wealth of understanding and knowledge leads him to solutions that are improbable and yet still accurate. And again, it's a fiction show, so they're going to write it in a way that you're going to be drawn in. But I just thought it was masterfully done and gives you an understanding that there are very deep indications of how humans behave that if you understand, you can have outsized influence. And I'm going to go on a little aside here. One of my favorite bloggers of this election is Scott Adams, and he's the guy who writes Dilbert. And for the past 9 months, he's apolitical, has no association with any campaign. He's been talking about the rise of Donald Trump and the impact that his persuasive techniques are having. And far from being a crazy person, he is deliberate in a lot of his behaviors. And I think a lot of people, rightly so, think what he's advocating for is ridiculous and wrong. What Trump has been able to do, and now Clinton to some standpoint, is like tap into the deep cognitive psychological elements that have nothing to do with rationality, but are manipulating the electorate in a way that's incredibly effective. And even recognizing that we as human beings are not rational, that we instead are influenced by small things that we barely notice, I think is really important to understand about life in general. And I think Sherlock is one of those guys that can transmit that message in the way that he sees how humans behave and what the implications are there. And then for fractal theory, I got attracted to that based on Mandelbrot's work in finance, because I've been kind of a retail investor for a while, and he brings in a lot of his theories when it comes to looking at stock market charts, and like zooming in or zooming out, you get the same kind of stochastic randomness. And what does that imply about our systems as a whole? What does that imply about the world that we see? And what does it mean if small things are replicated in larger organizations in a lot of mathematical and societal structures? Like, how can we use that concept to understand how to organize human societies in ways that help them reach their full potential? So I just like the way he views the world, and thinking about things and patterns that maybe don't seem like patterns, but actually repeat themselves regardless of the size of scale is pretty fascinating.
Oh, sorry, Joe. I thought you were going to jump in there. Okay. So, sometimes on Google Hangouts, it's kind of hard to know who's talking next. Um, I want another area that I heard you talk about was this idea of loyal opposition from Joshua Marcus, one of your collaborators in the Pentagon, and this idea of agitating against the status quo is how we contribute to the mission. How balancing this idea of cohesive culture with with this idea of loyal opposition, how do you get that started? Like, you've talked a little bit about, yeah, you joined CRIC and you guys started this Disruptive Thinkers blog, but how did that really begin, and how did you get the ball moving on these things, or were they already in place when you came in?
So I think the critical element is if you want to be a rabble-rouser in a large organization, you have to have established credibility first, that you're not someone there just to throw bombs and blow it up. And that, for me, was professional competence and reaching a level of trust and proficiency where senior officers, regardless of my thoughts about the world, would at least know deep down I was committed to the organization, worked hard, and had proven that I could deliver on the very basic tasks that we were accomplished. And for me, that was, consistently landing on the carrier, not making mistakes in the air, having a good leadership track record. And then once you've established that, and you see something needs to be changed, you have the credibility to go in there and start pointing out the flaws and finding constructive ways to improve that. You have to understand the landscape and have the trust of senior people before you can just start, willy-nilly kind of making adjustments. But at the point of loyal opposition, when I'm looking for people that I want to work with and engage with, and I don't think this is widespread, but I actually look for people who can hold their own in an argument or a debate with me, because those are the type of people I want by my side. Because even though I might not agree, they're going to show me a view of the world that'll help me in challenging environments that are ambiguous and help me see things that I wouldn't otherwise recognize. And at the end of the day, if I'm the leader, I have to trust that whatever decision I make, they're going to follow it. But at the same time, I want them to raise the issues that could cause problems. I want them to, and this is a challenge I have with my wife, is she's a notorious backseat driver, and I'm like a very competent driver. And it frustrates me to no end whenever she points out like traffic or a car she's going to hit us. At the same time, there have been moments when she's saved us, and so like it's a difficult balancing act because if you repress those instincts, 90% of the time she's wrong and it makes me frustrated. If she doesn't believe she can say those things, the 10% of the time when it matters, then catastrophe happens. So you have to be willing to accept the kind of irrationality for the one or two moments that have exponential negative outcomes and allow that to transpire. So it's certainly a difficult thing to do, but having the recognition and understanding that this is important will make your organization better and really, again, entrust and empower your subordinates to make decisions that are in the best interest of both the organization and your own leadership.
Ben, that was awesome. You've given us like an hour's worth of things to go back and parallel and find how we can use them within education. And like I said, what attracted us to you was immediately, we complain and whine and struggle about making change within educational frameworks, and yet you've had the experience of doing it in a much larger, and I assume much more rigid framework as well. If in the future you have any partnerships with educators or looking for them, we would more than happy pair up with you on any kind of project.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you guys are doing. I'm glad you're thinking about these things. It's important.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, and hopefully we didn't take up all of your afternoon. And then we'll publish this directly, and then as we get our sessions together, we'll do a more formal publishing. I'm going to go ahead.
Okay, fantastic.
I'm going to disconnect now. If you stay online just for a second, please.